Hello, I'm Walk. For my Wednesday devotional words for First Presbyterian Church of Ocala, I've been surveying the history of Christian spirituality with a very broad and shallow look at the subject. We're now in the 20th century. I'll talk today and next week about Thomas Merton, then wrap up talking about Christian spirituality and take a break until mid-September. Thomas Merton did not grow up religious. His mother was American. His father was from New Zealand with ties in England. He was born in France in 1915. His parents both died before he was 16. Merton attended boarding school in France and England, and then Clare College at Oxford University for a year. He traveled in Europe and went to Columbia University in New York City, where he majored in English literature and then taught and worked on a master's degree. Merton had a dynamic and dramatic conversion to Christianity and was baptized in November of 1938 when he was a senior at Columbia. He recorded this in his famous memoir, The 7-Story Mountain. Soon he felt called to be a priest, even a monk. God called him to be a cloistered monk in the isolated hills of central Kentucky. He entered the monastery in December of 1941. I'm skipping a lot, and I encourage you to read about Thomas Merton on Wikipedia or on the Merton Center website. I'll try to link those, especially the Merton Center, maybe in the comments of the YouTube page. The Thomas Merton Center at Bellarmine University in Louisville is a great source of information. I visited there last fall. Thomas Merton was brilliant. He was a gift of God to the 20th century. He wrote profusely, publishing many books. I count 27 in English. One source, a biographer, said he wrote 100 books. He wrote scholarly articles and newsletter articles and had a vast and wide-ranging correspondence in America and internationally with church leaders and others. He had interfaith conversations with Buddhist and Hindu scholars and monks. He began corresponding with African American church leaders in the 1950s. He recognized and wrote about the sin of white supremacy as early as 1963. He was deeply concerned about race relations in America, also about war and peace. And he did all this while living as a monk and hermit behind the high wall of an abbey in the middle of Appalachia. I should clarify that he was allowed by his abbot to travel and speak, and he went to Louisville on monastery business and often to the doctor. He had chronic health problems. I've read several of Merton's biographies and his memoir that I mentioned, The 7-Story Mountain. In 1990, I was on a retreat at a monastery in South Carolina. I met a monk who had known Merton, been one of his students at Gethsemane Monastery in the 1960s. I was there on a special day when the monks were allowed to speak to one another and to visitors. I wish I had known more and thought to ask him questions. What made Thomas Merton special? Well, he was a mystic, and by mystic I mean one who explored the mysteries of God, who was willing to spend days, even weeks in silence, contemplating and praying, studying the Bible and literature. He was of the world and also separated from it. He had visions from God and sought to make the world a better place through more than just prayer. He was a mystic. In his book, Confessions of a Guilty Bystander, he wrote about one such religious experience that he recorded in his journal in 1958. In Louisville, at the corner of 4th and Walnut, in the center of the shopping district, I was suddenly overwhelmed with the realization that I loved all these people. And they were mine, and I was theirs, and we could not be alien to one another, even though we were total strangers. It was like waking from a dream of separateness, of spurious self-isolation in a special world. This sense of liberation from an illusory difference was such a relief and such a joy to me that I almost laughed out loud. I have the immense joy of being a man, a member of a race in which God himself became incarnate. Besides being a mystic, Merton was also a scholar. He spoke and read many languages, including ancient ones. His first job in the monastery, and every monk has a job, his first vocation was translating ancient texts of the church fathers into English. Later in the monastery, he was a teacher and the novice master. He was in charge of the young monks for about 10 years, from the late 1950s to early 60s. Many times when he was teaching, he spoke into a microphone for a reel-to-reel tape recorder. So we have many of Merton's lectures on audio. I've been listening to some this week. This is very important for us Presbyterians to hear. Thomas Merton was a scholar and public intellectual by any measure. He read several languages. He wrote and published. His was an intellectual faith. And he was a spiritual mystic who sat quietly listening for God. He corresponded with and visited with monks in Asia, and they talked about all that they had in common. I'm afraid we Presbyterians prize the intellect and disregard contemplation of the mysteries of God and the world. We Presbyterians seem to be afraid of spirituality and ethereal things like that. I think one has to be rational or emotional, thinking or feeling. Not with Merton. This is why I wanted to take a number of weeks and briefly tell the story of Christian spirituality in these Wednesday words. There are many Christians from the time of St. Paul in the book of Acts through the early church and the long history of the faith, including many Protestants who've practiced spirituality and an intellectual faith. Many times there's been a Protestant spirituality, but we haven't called it that and might not recognize that, like the revivals or Methodism. Howard Thurman, who I talked about last week, and Thomas Merton bridge that intellectual study and living and show us a path to do that. Among his scores of books, Merton wrote Literary Criticism and a study of Albert Camus. He was planning a book on William Faulkner and the classical religion found in Faulkner's writing. When he lectured the novice monks on Faulkner in 1967, a recording was made. It's fascinating to hear him teach and interact with monks and priests, as well as what he sees in Faulkner's stories. He also wrote about the Bible and Christian living and history, but especially spirituality. He was very much a man of his time, especially the 1960s. The monastery had a record player, and there was folk music in the library. In his 50s, Merton listened to Joan Baez and Bob Dylan and reflected on their soulful lyrics in his journal. This is a good place to stop. I encourage you to read about Thomas Merton. Next week, I'll tell you a few more stories about him and wrap up this series, which I have really enjoyed.